Welcome to the CEO's Cyber Briefing podcast. No jargon, no fluff, just the truth about what's really at risk. Hosted by me, David Fleckner, CEO of Sentra, where we're helping companies stay secure and breach resistant. Each week, I will sit down with CISOs, ex-hackers, and founders to unpack the real-world threats CEOs need to understand before it's too late. In this week's episode, I'll be featuring Peter Cooper, a veteran CISO who's led security for fintechs, global banks, and high-stake IPOs, and believes that most boards today are sleepwalking into a disaster. This is your cyber briefing. Enjoy. Peter, welcome to the very first episode of the CEO's Cyber Briefing podcast. Very glad to have you as our first guest. Now, you've helped shape security at some of the most regulated high-stake environments in fintech. When somebody asks you at a dinner party, for example, what do you actually do? How do you explain it in plain English?
That's a question that I try to answer in as many different ways as I can, because each of them are fun and each of them are really interesting. If it's a restaurant, not a dinner party, I say, you know those payment terminals? I secured them. That means that your card data is not going to be stolen by anyone between you and your bank. At a more normal dinner party, to avoid people glazing their eyes and wanting to make a quick run for the exits, I talk a little bit about how our world is really built on sand, literally. We use glass fibers to communicate under oceans. We compute in our phones and on our computers with silicon chips, all made of sand. And all of these things, they're essential to our daily lives. 100 years ago, we didn't need these things to have dry feet in the morning, or to have clean water delivered to our homes, or to be warm enough in bed, or to make sure that grandma makes it through the night alive. So what I do and what my teams do is we make sure that everyone's on board with the challenge of securing all of those systems and devices from those who might wish to do bad things or wish us ill will. So it's a lot more complicated in the details, but that's really it. It's a very practical communications discipline, which just happens to have a lot of risk management, a lot of stakeholder management, and a lot of technology involved.
So on a day-to-day level then, what are the kind of 3-4 key things that you would do each day? Or is every day different?
Every day is different, but there are a couple of things very much in common. Like I said, it's a communications discipline in some sense. I'm trying to make sure that all of the effort that we're all doing, and not just in my organization, but across the organization, is aligned. So that means that every day I'll be in quite a few meetings trying to make sure that the right concerns are raised, that we've got enough critical thinking going on, not just in my organization, but also in technical delivery teams, account management, vendor relationships, and also senior management. So I will be typically talking to a senior manager every day, an exec, someone on the board, maybe even the supervisory board of a business. Every week or two, I'll be talking to a regulator or an auditor.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people have this perception of people who work in cybersecurity as it being quite an underground, hood up type thing. But obviously what you guys do is, especially in sort of today's economy, what you guys do is so critical. I know from speaking with lots of people like you that it can also be a very stressful job, especially when the shit hits the fan. Can you take us back to a moment when the stakes were really high? Like maybe if you're going through an IPO, a license process, or a breach. Can you take us back to that moment and the pressure and the stress?
Yeah, I have a fun one. It was pretty stressy at the time, but may have not been quite as critical as some of the other incidents that I've dealt with. But it's easier to talk about, and no one will be angry at me for telling this particular story. It was in a very, very large global financial institution, and we were involved in an extremely intensive technical audit about our security. And we were the kind of organization that didn't want no findings. So we had architected things to be pretty secure, but our goal was to find stuff that we needed to fix. So This is a 2-week engagement with some very, very, very good technical pen testers, red teamers, who were brought in by one of our major customers, one of the world's largest companies. And we, at first, tried to see whether they could get into our building. We then slowly graduated the amount of access they had. We gave them a laptop with no credentials. Then we gave them a laptop with credentials as if they were someone who worked on the reception desk. Then we gave them a laptop with software engineer credentials who does not actually log into production systems, but can actually influence the software artifacts that we create. And they weren't making very many findings, although there were a couple of interesting ones. But then very late in the piece, they were able to find a chink in our armor in the most critical part of our network. We had to use a piece of software provided by one of our big partners running on a system that was almost impossible to secure. It was bad technology, in my opinion, but real business involves compromises. And so we've done our very best to make sure that the defense in depth, that is, all of the different moats and walls and turrets and spikes were in the way, but they were able to find a way through. And almost the very last layer of defenses was present. And at that moment, my CTO came into the room that we were occupying and said, "We have a production issue. We found a bug, we think, in the Linux kernel, and it's causing our firewalls to crash on a regular basis. We need to take down the security around this most secure enclave of our company." And I looked at him and I looked at the red teaming people wearing their union required hoodies. And I said, production always comes first. We have to do this. And if there is a report to our clients and potentially even a government agency, which they might have been mandated to do, it is what it is. We're going to have to deal with the consequences. So we took down the firewalls around that most critical enclave. Within 5 minutes, the red teamers were on the system and they were saying, "This looks really bad. It doesn't look like your stuff." And I said, "Well, you've just hit pay dirt. This is actually the weak underbelly. I will give you the context about why you've suddenly got access to this. You do win the gold star." And I had a real sinking feeling when I told the CTO, "Yes, just go ahead. The business comes first. This is not an actual attack, although it could have been. We have to make the choice in this particular context to take the heat." In the end, the investment in the relationship with the technical auditors and red teamers paid off. They did actually note the finding, but said it was not serious because actually taking down your security infrastructure for an urgent operational issue during a pen test was the right call. So in fact, the end report was not damning. It could have been very easily. But the set of trade-offs that we all have to do every single day are as complicated or as simple as that. What comes first? What cost do we pay? At that same organization, we had a major availability incident, which meant that everyone was working for 2 weeks nonstop, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I had executives dialing in to telephone bridges to pep people up at 4 a.m, my team. So, you're not alone in a good organization, but it is high stakes, high pressure. There's 3 years of my life that I didn't actually get more than 4 hours sleep in a night because of many things going on. It is what it is. So it's not easy, but in the right organization, you do have the support, even at the top.
Yeah, and for those people who don't know, when you say red team, can you explain a little bit more about what a red team does?
Yeah, so red team is a group of people that you pay to pretend to be genuine cyber attackers. And they're going to be probably a lot better than many of the cyber attackers that come knocking on your business's front door because they're paid well, they're well trained, and they tend to get a lot of experience that the people on the street don't get. Organizations like mine that let them slowly in to see how far they can get, that you get a lot more muscle memory and experience than if you're just a bog standard attacker. They typically also have a budget to research many things. So the red team is the opposite of the blue team. I'm wearing my blue t-shirt to show that I'm on the blue team. I'm a defender. And the red team are the attacker.
So that they're basically there to try and infiltrate the company's systems. Yeah.
You set a goal with them and a scope. And you say, this is, if you can achieve this, you get the flag. You win the contest. If you get this, then it's slightly less of a win. My goal is always to get the findings. I want findings. I'm going to fully cooperate with them in a graduated fashion. I want them to see if they can break down the front door. But if they can't break down the front door, then I will give them a key to my front door so that they can actually take the next step.
And these people are also known as ethical hackers.
Ethical hackers, although red teams typically are a little bit more focused on pure attack. Ethical hackers, it's a rather larger spectrum of kinds of work that people do. But it's the same concept. They're not doing things to relieve you of your Bitcoin wallet. They're doing this to improve your security.
You mentioned something a moment ago about having the buy-in of your board. Again, I know from experience of speaking to CISOs that that's not always the case. Now, when you're in the boardroom and people aren't taking cyber seriously, what do you do? How do you kind of deliver those hard truths?
My strategy these days is to be using the same loss estimates as the finance team does, even if possible, engaging with the people in the finance team who make those models. Not all organizations are mature enough to have that. But then we're talking the same language, and because the people who are making the growth forecasts, but also the downside forecasts for, say, merger and acquisition activities, they're making the same models for us. It's much harder for a discussion about our area to be dismissed when other areas with similar kinds of numbers are being fully discussed. So that's actually a trick for young players, I think. It's not often done. We typically in the security field come from backgrounds which tend to be a bit more in the hard sciences, computer science, mathematics. Not so many economists, not so many musicians, although those people also exist and are very, very, very useful in our field. But because of the general bias in the industry, we all get very uncomfortable about imprecise models. But the world runs on imprecise models. All business decisions are made on assumptions and estimates and spreadsheets, and we need to talk the same language and do the same kinds of things. So annualized loss estimates are a really great way to talk a little bit with people on a board who typically have an MBA background, who typically come from law or accounting backgrounds. So they understand these kinds of things. They're exposed to them for a long time. And you need to come to where they are rather than just talking your own language. A couple of nights ago, I actually ran a workshop on this for the London Security Engineers meetup. Got them to split into two groups to pitch to a CFO, fake CFO selected from the group, about two different choices they had. And this security engineer who was chosen to be the CFO, his response at the end of this debate between these two teams was, "You never talked about money."
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a challenge in the security field, is that we don't necessarily always talk the language of the people who need to understand in their context what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it might cost this amount of money, but what is it preventing?
So what would you advise then? I mean, you just said there about, speaking the same language, but you also mentioned that, a security person does come from quite a very different background to a CEO, for example. How would you advise CEOs and security people? Like, is there a way that you can learn each other's language? You mentioned finance people, you talk numbers. What would you advise?
Open and honest communication.
Yeah.
Open and honest communication. Ask if I'm a CISO in an organization, I ask the CEO, how do you need to hear things? What would help you understand? Quite often you won't get a particularly good answer because it is a specialism unto itself. But you can make proposals. You can say, well, would you like a risk model a little bit like your more recent NA activities? Well, that would be handy. Okay, we can work with finance to do that. Or are you interested in likelihood and magnitude of impact? Some of them are. Some of them very much like heat maps and dots, but mostly not. Would you like a narrative, or would you like us to walk the board through a couple of potentially business-ending scenarios and what we're doing about it? A group of people has different languages, and each group of people have different backgrounds.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from that is it's a case of having a pre-discussion before the actual discussion.
Always.
What's your outcome here? What do you want to achieve? How can I communicate this to you in a way that you understand it? And then you actually go into that meeting and talk the same language.
Absolutely. And at the risk of perhaps spilling a very, very big secret of business life, pre-discussions are where all the action happens. If you have not done the pre-discussion with each of the key stakeholders before the formal event, it's not going to work nearly as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Really good advice. And what do you think is the biggest misconception you see amongst boards and execs when it comes to cyber risk?
I think because many haven't grown up through technology and as digital natives, their view of technology is very much more tied to concrete technology that they use every day. So they will look at technology through the lens of their laptop and their phone
Yeah.
more than they will something very abstract like a cloud or Lambda functions. So uh, typically, boards will be much more worried about something like ransomware, which is a real threat, and it absolutely, depending on which architectural choices you as a business have made, might be a significant threat for your organization, rather than cloud runtime protection, which is where all your crown jewels are. So it's terrible to have all of your laptops in your company ransomware. This is a terrible thing. It's terrible if all of your servers are ransomware. Terrible thing. These things can be substantially prevented through good architectural choices and good, sensible operational steps. But only focusing on that does not prevent the destruction of your business. And the problem is that sort of focus on the concrete rather than the distant or cloudy.
I was having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with quite a prominent figure in the security world, and he had quite an interesting take on something that I wanted to run by you and get your perspective as well. So his kind of hypothesis, if you like, is companies that have frameworks in place like SOC 2 and ISO, they have a fake or a false sense of security because they've gone through the process and they think that that's all they need, and that's kind of the end point of their security. What's your take on that?
Every major company that gets breached has a list of certifications, security certifications. Compliance is not security. However, if you use compliance in the right way, it can enable good security outcomes, but it is not the security outcome in and of itself. You can check things off with an auditor looking over your shoulder and still be vulnerable. They can't check for everything. They can't always see where your processes fail, where your technology fails, where your people fail. So compliance gives you the framework to address many issues structurally, but it does not prove that you're doing it everywhere and consistently and well.
So is that something you see as being quite common, where companies have gone through these frameworks, they've been approved, they've got the certificates on their wall? Can that then be for them, okay, we are now secure, we don't need to invest in people like you or additional technology to really kind of ramp things up?
Okay, I've seen it from very small to very large. So there's the very famous breach of Knights of Old, a ransomware attack actually. It was a very old moving company, more than 150 years old, I think, in the UK. 700 people lost their job in the end of the process, went bankrupt. I read an interview with the CEO who said, well, we hired a security guy and we thought everything was fine. And I think that's the same metaphor as, well, we have a security team that gets us SOC 2 or gets us ISO 27001. We must be secure. And that's not the whole story, right? You do need to make sure that you've got a governance process around all of those activities. And you've got to be asking questions about assurance. How do we know that this piece of paper is not enough? How do we know? What are we doing? How do we review? Is this good enough? Are there new things? All of the standard questions that a good governance process should have. And you cannot just hand it off to an external auditor or that part-time security person who is somehow, hopefully, doing good things to your Windows servers.
I mentioned at the beginning of the show that you've obviously worked across the fintech space, which is highly regulated. What does security leadership look like in a highly regulated environment? Does it differ from, say, a traditional kind of SaaS company?
It does. There are the obvious reasons and the less obvious reasons. The obvious reasons are, of course, that the board and the exco have their feet to the fire in terms of losing their license to operate if things go badly wrong. And they have some very, very big concerns. Those big concerns are not nearly as big though as can we continue selling at this rate? What are our margins? How can we scale? Why is it so difficult for us to go live in Japan? All of those kinds of things. These are really existential for future revenue for these organizations. But security does sit sort of in the back of the top bunch of concerns. They don't want to lose their license to operate. In organizations where that is less true, security falls quite a lot further, typically down the list of concerns. And it is very, very important that the security outcomes are tied to other outcomes that the board really cares about. For example, in the B2C business, reputation is quite important typically. So you tie your security program into customer and market reputation. If you are in an organization where next day delivery is key, then you tie your security program into making sure that the logistics program that you have operating throughout your global business is effective and does not lead to major interruptions of service because some hackers decided to take down your logistics applications. So look at Maersk, for example. So the difference is real in less regulated businesses, and they're all regulated to some extent now. We've got GDPR, we've got CRA, we've got UK OR, DORA, NIS2. Many, many more businesses are either directly regulated or indirectly regulated because they're a service provider for a regulated entity. So increasingly, that's going to be the case that we're all going to be working in somewhat regulated organizations, but not all boards, not all senior execs have caught up to this, and it makes it a much harder sell, but it's a very important sell. Even if you're not working in critical national infrastructure, the services that you provide and perhaps the services that your clients provide to consumers and to businesses is quite critical to keep our economy operational. I know organizations where if Slack were permanently down, they would not be able to operate anymore. So we may say that, Slack is Slack, but it contains huge amounts of personal data. It contains business processes embedded in the way that we use its channels, all of these kinds of things. And each of these kinds of supplier businesses, and almost certainly everyone who's listening to this is in one of those, even if they're not regulated, is key to the success of other organizations.
Something I hear a lot being banded around is this idea of creating a security culture within a company. How would a company, say a tech startup, how do they create a culture of security awareness, if you like, within a company?
Okay, so this is actually a question I love. I agree that culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. Culture is the massive enabler for business success that almost nothing else is. If you have people aligned, if they're the triad that I think about is behaviors, values, and beliefs. If these things are aligned commercially, technologically, from a security or risk perspective, you can achieve amazing things. You'll notice that I didn't talk about awareness. I think awareness isn't nearly as actionable or as useful as the audit frameworks we use for security might lead us to believe. Awareness training, for example, is that I can prove that I locked these group of 10 people into a darkened room and force them to watch slides and sign off on a piece of paper at the end of that sweaty session. Show me anything about outcomes. Ultimately, it's the behaviors, it's the actions that deliver outcomes. So that's why I care about behaviors. Behavior is not just, do I click on phishing emails, but how do I respond if I do? It's about, did I reach out to a colleague if I've got a security question when I'm developing software? Do I make sure that there is a threat analysis done on a new piece of software that we're developing as a product manager? These are the behaviors. But you don't get behaviors on their own. You can't whip people into doing stuff, not substantially, not if it's not directly part of their job description or a work process that is key to delivering money. So you also need these values and beliefs to support those behaviors. The values of an organization are about what we consider as important. Does the customer always come first? Or like in a case of a company like Lego, children always come first. The interests of the child always come first. That means that they've got an incredible data protection culture. They've got an incredible payment data security culture. They've got a great engineering culture. They've got a great packaging culture, all for those reasons. So these values can also tie into security. And the beliefs, maybe that's the closest thing to awareness. I believe this is how the world works. I believe that we're under attack or we could be under attack at any time. I believe that what we are doing as an organization is important for our clients. And we don't often talk about this particular triad. We certainly never measure behaviors. We don't try and understand what are the values of our people and what are their beliefs and help shape them to suit the outcomes we want as an organization more broadly, let alone in security. So I typically in organizations, I work very hard on beliefs, values, and behaviors. And I still regularly get contacted by former colleagues in organizations with like now 5,000 employees or 10,000 employees saying, I just started a new job at a different place and I realized no one locks their laptops. But everyone who came through your trainings always does because we really understand why. We understand what's important. And this is a behavior that we do without thinking about it. And ultimately, that's the thing that drives the change, right? It's not having to think about things means it's very easy to do. And I'm not just talking about locking laptops. I'm really talking about if you're in a product organization, actually making sure that you get your software engineers to do the threat modeling exercise. And that's documented. And that's just a matter of course. And it doesn't even take very much time once you've done it a few times. It's actually invisible in your work breakdown structure. And that's fine. Yeah. We're super happy with that. But you've got to believe it. And you've got to have the values that this is important. And you've got to have the behaviors just baked in.
Yeah, I think we've all been there where we've been through these. I've been through a couple of online trainings in previous companies, and as good as it is, it might last a couple of hours, but once it's done, you don't hear anything about cybersecurity. Again, it's part of a tick box for your ISO or whatever it might be that you're going for at that time. So I think you're right. I think sort of regular training for people, because sometimes, and you taught me, and we've talked about this a lot, it's the basic things that you do day in, day out that can make a real big difference. It's not always like the fancy AI cyber attack, it's just stuff like locking your computer. It's having, a two-factor authentication on every device, all that kind of very simple stuff. But if we do the training once, we tend to forget about it. But it's that repetition and having someone come in on a regular basis.
Absolutely. One of the other points I will make is I think security training should be fun. It should make you laugh. It should make you think. I've been a victim of too much dead-eyed security training. At one of the places I worked, I had an amazing team working with me who 4 times a year would deliver a hysterically funny 10-minute video with animations or live action, talking about really only 3 kind of goals with maybe 10 actionable points that people needed to remember, but always with humor. And as we released it onto the work floor, I would walk the work floor and I would hear the ripples of laughter as people picked up their next training pack, and they did it with enthusiasm. It wasn't something we typically had to chase people to do because it was fun. And we ran a questionnaire after it to make sure that the 10 learning items were actually received. Behaviors are so important. So we tried to, even in a questionnaire, you can kind of model behaviors like force rank these things. But then we typically were able to see, yes, the messages have landed and they've been able to do it at least once. If you can do it once after a training, you're much more likely to be able to do it twice or 3 times or more. But also if people are looking forward to it, if it goes viral and people are messaging the company saying, have you seen the new training? It's excellent. It's Stadler and Waldorf in the Muppet Theater complaining about colleagues. Just be creative. Do things that are really interesting. If you make it a compliance training, no one is going to recall it in 15 minutes.
I agree more. No, I think that's a really interesting idea to make it fun, to make it something that people can engage with and do it on a regular basis.
And we used narrators who were well known in the company globally who were not security people.
Yeah.
We wanted colleagues' voices, not our voices, because it's actually colleagues' concern, not just our concern.
If a board member or a CEO is listening to this show right now and they do nothing, or even if they're not listening to the show and they're not really paying attention to their security, what are they ultimately gambling with?
They're gambling on a destruction of value and potentially the end of their business, like with the poor team at Knights of Old. 700 people lost their jobs, including the board. The owners lost virtually everything. It's a very old family firm, a terrible disaster. Even if you're not disbarred from ever being a director again, that's a pretty high price to pay. I think the emotional trauma of rolling down a business or rolling down business units because you can't pay salaries is a very, very, very grim thing, let alone regulatory involvement. So no one is interested in a 3-month crisis management exercise involving external lawyers and consultants at a very, very high price. So the costs individually to people are very high, but also the costs to an organization that you've built up and you've grown and very few senior managers are disconnected from their businesses. Their identity is very tied up in their organizations. It's so key to make sure that just like you don't let small children run across roads in front of trucks, you also want to make sure that your business is safe and operating sensibly with the appropriate controls in place. These are typically not so expensive. They're not so complicated, but they do need to be tuned to your particular situation and your particular choices. And it's an easier journey, I think, to secure a business properly than to not.
Yeah, and we've seen with the recent cyber attacks in the retail sector with and the likes that customer trust gets really dented and badly affected when these attacks happen. I can't remember the percentage, but they were saying in an article recently that M&S have lost a lot of customers over this. So that for me is probably one of the biggest things that a company is going to be gambling with, is that customer trust, and it's the customers that ultimately pay the shareholders their money.
Absolutely, and cost of customer acquisition in a retail context can be from relatively low to £5 to £1,000, depending on what the product is. But in B2B and enterprise, it can be up to millions, and that's a huge chunk of lifetime value of the relationship. And I think generally for smaller organizations, it hits harder because each client is more important. If you're a very large organization, maybe you've got some reserves, operational reserves that you can tap into. You can weather a couple of bad quarters. But typically smaller organizations are a little bit closer to the line, and they've got far fewer resources to manage consumer sentiment, public relations. So it's a much harder journey, and typically the execs in smaller organizations, it's all on their shoulders to deal with the fallout. And instead of that, you should be growing your business. You should be serving your customers. You should be maybe enjoying yourself from time to time instead of being in a horrible major incident response mill for 3 or 4.
Yeah. Peter, last question. What is the number one mindset shift you think every CEO, business owner should be adopting right now when it comes to cybersecurity?
For me, I think try and work out how security can be an enabler for future value. Ask that question concretely of your technology and security providers inside or outside of the organization. How does this enable an increase in value in my organization? How can you help me? And sometimes it's things that might be ignored, like security questionnaires in a B2B context. Sometimes it's about strengthening your GDPR controls. Quite often it's about how great ideas about how we can do things more simply and more securely as an organization, decrease our unit cost economics while improving our security posture. If you challenge people to think about your perspective, they will step up.
Brilliant. Great way to end the show. Peter, thank you so much for being our first guest. Really insightful as always. Hopefully people are left with plenty of actionable tips. Thank you for those who have listened. Stay tuned for future episodes where we're going to be connecting you and learning from some of the greatest and brightest minds in the world of cybersecurity. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, David. It was an honor.